Leonardo da Vinci, Chapter 1, Boy of Vinci. When you go to Florence, Italy, and look at the city and the rocky, hilly country around it, you may think that all of this has changed very little since the great palaces and bridges were first built. And you will be right. Those bare or olive-covered hills of Tuscany and the long, empty valleys between the hill ranges are just the same. And those castles and walls, those bell towers in the distance, are not very different from the scenes the Italians looked upon 500 years ago. The city itself would not seem strange today to Leonardo da Vinci, who lived there long ago. Of course, he would notice that the old city walls have broken down and a number of houses have sprung up beyond. He would recognize the Pitti Palace and the Medici tomb and the workshops of the goldsmiths. He would remember the bridges and the golden glow of the stone itself, for the stone of which many of these houses are built seems, through the centuries, to have soaked in something of the hot sun of Florentine summers. Leonardo was born in 1452 near Vinci, a village not far from Florence. He was about the same age as Christopher Columbus. If you think of them as if they belonged together, you will not be wrong. They belonged to the same age and shared the spirit of that age, the spirit of exploration, curiosity, and desire for truth. A stranger to our civilization might wonder why we pay such tribute to Leonardo da Vinci. He might very well ask us to show what this man has done to make us talk of him with such admiration. I imagine that he would say, "I can understand your reverence for Columbus. He discovered the New World. I can see why you would make a fuss about Michelangelo. There are all his statues and pictures as proof of his genius, or Botticelli, or any of the other artists of the time. I can understand why you remember Luther, who was soon to stir up a revolt in Germany against the great church. I can see why you would remember villains like the bourgeois. All these 15th century people did something, or left something, to prove how they affected the world. But what did Leonardo leave behind that explains all this excitement over his name? From what I can make out, he left precious little, few paintings or bits of painting in other people's compositions. A few pieces of sculpture, evidence that he planned a great statue, but never finished it. A number of little notebooks of scribbles and sketches. That's all. Why do you honor the name of Leonardo da Vinci? If you look at it that way, the stranger's question is hard to answer. But the fact is, we do remember Leonardo. We do honor him for what he was, and we think of him as a greater man even than Botticelli. The world has always made known he was a great man, even before his famous notebooks were gathered up and studied. His reputation began during his lifetime and has never died out, though it has had its ups and downs. The remarkable thing about Leonardo was that he was interested in everything. Centuries before anyone else had even started to guess about many subjects, Leonardo seems to have known a good deal about them. Of course, he was a great painter as well, but he didn't leave enough of his work to prove it to those who demand quantity as well as quality. He was a very good-looking man. People who knew him said he was the most beautiful man who ever lived, but he had no famous love affairs. He never married or had any family. Unlike so many heroes that we love to read about in America, he didn't illustrate a great success story against tremendous odds. In his lifetime, he didn't have the honor he deserved. No, those ordinary romantic stories have nothing to do with Leonardo. He was great purely because of his tremendous intellect. It was his brain that created the adventure of his life, and that adventure is still exciting today, 5 centuries later. Leonardo's father was Piero da Vinci, meaning of the village of Vinci. He was a young lawyer, son of a long line of lawyers. Leonardo was nurtured and taught as well as any boy in the village. But it is probable that the local school was quite mediocre, even though Vinci was near Florence and the new enthusiasm for learning had spread out a long way. Leonardo's father was a clever and capable lawyer, and there was much coming and going in the family between Vinci and Florence. But the boy Leonardo wasn't a quiet, well-behaved pupil. He neglected Latin and mathematics and literature. Indeed, he seems to have preferred finding things out in his own way, at his own speed. Frequently, he would slip away to climb the rocky mountains that surrounded his home. There he would gather fish and other small animals and watch the way the rivers ran. One day, as he was to remember later, he stood for a long time staring at a layer of rock that he came across, high up in a cave in the wind-swept hills. There were shells embedded in that rock, shells he recognized as belonging to some sort of sea creature, and the bones of a big fish. Now the seashells and bones had turned to stone, or fossils as we call them. How had they got there, miles away from the sea and hundreds of feet above sea level? Because they were part of the rock and embedded in it. Leonardo knew no person could have brought them all that way and left them to puzzle other people. Today we know the answer to that puzzle. That is not because we are cleverer than the people of Leonardo's day. It is because scientists have had 500 years longer in which to observe and experiment. But nobody could explain to Leonardo about seashells on a mountain because no one knew. Furthermore, not very many people even wondered why sea bones should be found in a mountain cave. But Leonardo had a thirsty curiosity that noticed things like that and a quick brain that tried to work out the answers. That is why he was so remarkable a person. He had a modern brain, yet through some freak of chance, he was born way back in 1452. Probably you have heard of the Renaissance, which means rebirth or renewal, as an important period in European history. It is hard to name any particular dates for the Renaissance because it happened to different countries at slightly different times, spreading slowly through the continent of Europe. We know, however, that Leonardo was born right in the middle of the Italian Renaissance. He is so much a part of it that it is sometimes hard to decide whether Leonardo's genius flourished as a result of the influence of the age, or whether he gave the Renaissance a push by being the way he was. Probably both are true. Certainly, we know that an extraordinary number of important things happened in Leonardo's time. For example, printing with movable type was invented just 2 years after his birth. Paper was invented too, or at least rediscovered at this time. You can imagine what a difference paper and printing would make to a civilization which had depended on parchment and handwriting for its books. All of a sudden, books became comparatively cheap and plentiful, and those people who led the way in new thought were able to record their ideas for hundreds of others to read. With printed books, more and more people could learn about these new ideas. While Leonardo was a young man, Copernicus was born. Copernicus, who studied the theories of the ancients and finally published his conclusions that the world was round like a ball and moved around the sun. We know that Columbus, too, believed this. In fact, many learned men did. There were countless other investigations and theories springing up all around. Leonardo's interest in those fossils was a typical example. Probably his grandfather would not have bothered about them. There they were, he may have thought, if he thought anything. How they got there would probably not have interested men of that generation. But in Leonardo's world, the very air was different. It made people want to think. Science came into its own. One of the things it seemed natural for Leonardo to try to do was paint. Nowadays, it is hard for us to realize how important the arts of painting and sculpture seemed to men and women of 15th century Italy. Then, drawings and paintings and sculpture not only gave pleasure to the world, but were actually necessary, for there were no cameras or photographs. The only way to record the faces of famous people or the important events of history was to paint or draw or model them. Leonardo worked hard at his drawing. He made sketches and notes of the flowers and birds and rocks and fish that caught his eye. He was passionately interested in painting, not only in getting a scene down on canvas, but in discovering some new and better way to mix his paints. For in Leonardo's day, a good Florentine artist was responsible for the manufacture of his materials. One of the most exciting discoveries of the Renaissance was made in the field of art, for it was at this time that artists learned what we call the rules of perspective. Until then, pictures had been drawn or painted as a child makes pictures. Artists had ignored the fact, obvious to us, that objects seen at a distance are small, and those close up seem large. Without any hesitation, they painted scenes in which angels hung in the clouds like giants, as large in the distance as the saints on the ground close to the viewer's eye. But during the Renaissance, artists began to realize that two parallel lines stretching out into the distance look as if they were coming together. They began to play with the new fashion, pointing out jubilantly to each other that with careful application of the rules of perspective, they could play any number of tricks. They could make their pictures look much more real. They caught the trick of using light and shade to make rich velvet gleam on the picture as it really did in the hand. They learned to cause the limbs and face of some figure to appear as if they actually stood out on the canvas. Perspective was a wonderful new toy. In the great studios of Florence, it was the chief topic of conversation among artists and their apprentices. At home in Vinci, young Leonardo also experimented and played the new game of perspective. He was a tall, beautiful, fair-haired boy, about 13 years old, when one day his skill tempted him to try something harder. A peasant who lived near the Vinci family came in carrying a large round piece of wood. He had cut it from a fig tree felled on his land. "I thought this would make a nice shield, Sir Piero," he said to Leonardo's father, "because it's a good piece of wood." He was referring to the decorative paintings or colored carvings on wood that people liked to hang outside their doors or on their walls as a kind of coat of arms. "Do you know some painter in Florence who would do it reasonably for me? You're well acquainted in the town." Ser Piero said amiably that he could get it done. Then he forgot all about the piece of wood and lay it around the house until Leonardo noticed it was getting warped. He straightened it out, oiled it, polished it, saw that it was properly cured. Actually, he had no special interest in it, but he was a boy who liked to work with his hands as well as his brain. Ser Piero noticed him at it and said, "You're always painting. Why not have a try at turning out something useful for a change? See if you can decorate this shield in a reasonable manner." This was a challenge. Father and son weren't getting on very well just then. This sometimes happens when a boy is growing up, and Leonardo's stepmother could hardly be expected to stand up for him. The boy took the wood into his own room and set about planning a design for it and collecting as models every queer little creature he could find in the woods and streams, lizards, crickets, snakes, and bats. Soon the dead bodies of the animals began to decay, but he was so busy at his task he paid no attention to the smell. He used different features of each for the monster he painted on the shield, copying the eyes of one, the horrid jaws of another, the tufted ears of a third. From these he portrayed a horrible dragon breathing fire. Then he covered up his window, leaving only one ray of light that fell full on the shield, and called his father to come and look at it. Ser Piero was completely fooled because he was accustomed to the flat paintings of artists who didn't know the secret of perspective. He thought the dragon was alive and coming at him. In fact, he actually turned and started to run. It was a triumph for Leonardo. Never again did Ser Piero underrate his son. He bought an ordinary cheap shield in Florence for the peasant, who was very happy to have it, and sold Leonardo's work for a big sum. This incident convinced the lawyer that Leonardo's future lay in some Florentine studio, apprenticed to one of the well-known painters there. He began making inquiries around the city. He had new plans for himself as well, and resolved to move his household to Florence. In 1468, when Leonardo was 16, the whole family left Vinci and set up housekeeping in the big city.